Imagine standing in a naval courtroom where your fate is sealed before you even speak, because the laws were written by men who believed women couldn't possibly be pirates. What chance did a woman have in such a place? Almost none. And history, cold and unforgiving, proves it. Before we dive deeper into these shocking stories, make sure to subscribe for more untold moments from history, and let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Captured female pirates rarely received mercy. During the 17th and 18th centuries, the so-called Golden Age of piracy, British Admiralty courts had no tolerance for lawbreakers at sea. But when the accused were women, the court's outrage doubled. These women had defied not only the empire's laws but the deeply rooted gender rules that shape society. Their trials were often held in makeshift naval tribunals, set up in colonies like Jamaica or New Providence. There were no juries, no real chances for defense, and most outcomes were decided long before the trial began. The proceedings were swift but theatrical. Testimonies came from ship captains, naval officers, and sometimes terrified sailors who feared being linked to piracy themselves. For the accused, there were few rights to claim. In 1720, two infamous pirates, and Bonnie and Mary Red, faced judgment in Spanish Town, Jamaica. When Bonnie's death sentence was pronounced, she turned to her lover, Calico Jack, and spat out the words history never forgot. "If you had fought like a man, you need not have been hanged like a dog." Their desperate plea, known as pleading the belly, claimed pregnancy as a reason to delay execution, a rare legal loophole for women. It worked for a time, sparing them temporarily. But most female pirates weren't as fortunate. Many met their fate in silence, knowing the verdict was written long before they entered the courtroom. At London's infamous execution dock, the river rolled silently as the crowd's cries broke the morning calm. Here, countless pirates, both men and women, met their end, hanging just above the murky waters of the Thames. The British Empire made sure every execution sent a message. Under the Piracy Act of 1698, passed by King William III, piracy was punishable by death. All and every person so offending shall suffer pains of death. Unlike land-based executions, these hangings were performed by the Admiralty itself, and the dock became a haunting symbol. Pirates would die with the same tide that once set them free. Women found guilty of piracy faced the same grim fate. The ritual was cruelly ceremonial. Prisoners were taken from Newgate Prison, paraded through the streets of London in carts, and jeered at by massive crowds. At Wapping, they stood under the gallows, often with the noose already tight around their necks. There was no long drop for mercy. Instead, the short fall led to slow strangulation, a ghastly sight sailors called the Marshal's Dance, as the body convulsed in its final moments. Though women were fewer among the executed, their deaths were no less brutal. Mary Critchett, an American woman who joined a pirate crew of escaped convicts in 1729, was captured near Virginia, tried in Williamsburg, and hanged swiftly. No plea of pregnancy, no last-minute pardon. Her death, like many others, was meant to terrify. Sometimes, the bodies of executed pirates were left hanging for days, until three tides had washed over them, a punishment known as gibbeting. It was more common for men, but even the threat of it sent a chilling message. Piracy would not be forgiven regardless of gender. In the shadow of the gallows, female pirates were stripped of their legend and turned into lessons, examples sacrificed for the sake of empire and order. And before the rope ever touched their necks, some women endured another horror: the whip. Flogging was an ancient, agonizing punishment used by naval courts and colonial governors to publicly humiliate prisoners. For women, it was both pain and spectacle. Their suffering made a warning for everyone watching. The cat-o'-nine-tails, a vicious whip of knotted cords, tore through flesh with each strike. Depending on the offense, sentences ranged from a dozen lashes to over 100. These floggings took place in public, on docks, in marketplaces, or outside prison gates, while crowds, including families and children, gathered to watch. In 1720, when Bonnie and Mary Read were captured by Jamaican authorities, they were held in appalling conditions, enduring harsh treatment even before their trial. While no record confirms they were flogged, other women captured in the Americas or the West Indies weren't so lucky. Flogging was often part of the sentence or a tool to extract confessions. For the naval authorities, the whipping of female pirates served two dark purposes: deterrence and degradation. It wasn't just punishment, it was propaganda. They had once ruled the decks with cutlasses and courage, but when the tide turned, those same women were dragged before the public, their blood mixing with the salt air and the cobblestones beneath their feet. These punishments weren't really about justice. They were about control. Every lash, every noose, every jeer from the crowd was a message, one meant to echo far beyond the gallows. But not every captured woman was hanged. In many cases, especially in colonial ports across the Caribbean, West Africa, and the Americas, their punishment was quieter and perhaps crueler. Some weren't executed at all. Instead, they were forced into concubinage, hard labor, or even slavery. If you're just joining us, make sure to subscribe for more untold stories of power and defiance. And let us know in the comments which city you're watching from. Now, when it comes to the fates of these women, the historical record is patchy. Evidence is scarce, but what little survives paints a disturbing picture. Piracy was a man's world, but the women who dared to take part met wildly different ends, depending on their race, nationality, class, and the whims of colonial authorities. In Spanish and Portuguese territories, the line between piracy, privateering, and slavery often blurred beyond recognition. Women captured aboard pirate ships, especially those of African or indigenous descent, were often treated not as prisoners but as property. Archival records from Portobello and Cartagena in the late 1600s describe women seized from pirate vessels and processed like spoils of war. Black and mixed-race women found aboard ships were almost automatically assumed to be enslaved. Many were sold into plantation life or absorbed as domestic servants and concubines by merchants, soldiers, or governors. These women vanished from official reports, their names lost to the margins of history. In the end, for many of them, capture didn't bring a swift execution. It brought something worse, a quiet erasure. They disappeared into households, plantations, or shipholds, stripped of name, freedom, and identity. Their stories weren't written in verdicts, but in silence. And for others, death came not on the gallows, but slowly, in the shadows of prison ships. Anchored just off the coasts of colonies and British harbors, these ships, once mighty war vessels, were turned into floating cages. They weren't built for long-term confinement, yet they became home to hundreds of prisoners. Pirates, rebels, and enemies of the crown. Among them, at times, were women. Though detailed records of female pirates dying aboard these ships are scarce, we know the conditions were horrific. In the 18th century, as jails overflowed, decommissioned warships were stripped of sails and moored in places like Portsmouth, Plymouth, and Kingston, Jamaica. Inside, the air was thick with filth and disease. Prisoners were chained below deck in pitch darkness, packed tightly together with barely room to breathe. Typhus, dysentery, and smallpox tore through the lower decks. Food was rotten, water scarce. For women, the suffering was doubled. Starvation and sickness were joined by abuse and exploitation from guards and sailors. Few records mention it directly, but the silence speaks volumes. Many women simply disappeared from the lists of prisoners altogether, as if they never existed. On those ghostly ships, history didn't record executions, it recorded absence. And that absence tells us everything. Their punishments weren't just about law, they were about domination, fear, and erasing those who defied the system. The story of female pirates exposes how deeply the maritime world feared women who refused to stay in their place. Their voices may have been buried beneath the waves, but their echoes remain, in the creak of old hulls, the whispers of prison decks, and the cold shadow of the gallows. What does their disappearance from history say about power, justice, and who gets remembered? Tell us what you think in the comments below. And if you haven't already, make sure to subscribe for more stories that history tried to forget. As the Roman historian Tacitus once wrote, "The more corrupt the state, the more numerous the laws."